Have you ever played a game that, when you were first playing it, you enjoyed it, but without really putting much thought into it, only to later realize quite a while after playing it that it might in fact be one of the best games you've ever played? For me, that game is the Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay. Something about this game is so compelling in a way that very few games at the time were, and almost no movie games have ever been. It's a game that seems to somehow revel in its self-seriousness without sacrificing any of the fun in the process. It seems, on one hand, designed to sincerely contribute to the universe of the Riddick franchise and take its setting and its main characters seriously, while also recognizing, on the other hand, that games should be an enjoyable experience start to finish. It's a game that understands how to adapt the mechanisms, tone, and themes of a series, while also offering a unique experience within that very same series. The developers who worked on the Butcher Bay game would go on to make the modern Wolfenstein series, a series that has been lauded for both its storytelling and its gameplay, and in particular I've heard quite a few comparisons to the original Half-Life. If you may recall, I did a video on the original Half-Life in which I called it a potential example of the first modern game. When I defined a modern game, I was defining it by its ability to blend separate genres of gaming in such a way that creates a coherent experience that never explicitly shows itself to be the sum of its parts. If we're going to trace the lineage of the modern action game with Half-Life as the starting point, then Butcher Bay is not necessarily the next step or even the next big step, but it is a very loud step, at least from my perspective. Butcher Bay is, perhaps even more so than Half-Life 2, the game that most carries the spirit of what the original Half-Life set out to achieve. A game defined by its seamlessness in blending different genres while also somehow using the lore of the series it comes from to its benefit rather than its detriment. This is a bit hyperbolic, but one could say it's the first good movie game. Not in the sense of being the first enjoyable movie game, but in the sense of being the first movie game to really make the series it stems from central to the gameplay and storytelling experience of the game. A game that captures the essence of its own associated film series so well, in fact, that it's in my opinion the pinnacle of the series as a whole, one of the rare movie games to actually be better than the movies. That's quite an accomplishment. So let's talk about how Butcher Bay manages to be such a ridiculously good game. So first I'd like to start by discussing the— oh god damn it! Oh my god, why did they decide to start with a cutscene? And he's fighting a fucking Yeti. Ugh. This is actually a good time to mention that one of the reasons why this game actually works is because it's built on the foundation of the Chronicles of Riddick series, a series that already is just covered to the head with schlock. I can never tell just how serious this series takes itself either, because it has all the makings of a bad pulp novel or an 80s action television series, including how serious the tone is, and including how utterly tone-deaf it becomes in the process. But this works very well when you translate the absurd science fiction action testosterone-fueled pulp epic of the film series into a high-budget action video game. Video games already take themselves very seriously, already have complete tone deafness with how to mix pulpy fun elements with serious tones, already have deep lore that is complete nonsense and only serves to make the series more bloated, and already has a bland as milk protagonist who is upheld as a beacon of power and masculinity despite being a completely uninteresting and even in a sense unlikable man. Speaking of which, in this Chronicles of Riddick game, you play as the titular character, John Chronicles of Riddick, otherwise known as Riddick for short. Riddick is one of those rare examples of a character who somehow manages to be a silent protagonist despite talking all the fucking time. The game is largely, though not exclusively, played in first person, and Riddick oftentimes will chime in either out loud or in his head to basically lay out the directions of the game for the player so that the player will never get stuck. This, of course, goes against my general philosophy of show don't tell, but we'll get to that when we discuss the gameplay. As I already said, the game stems from a series that already has all of the makings of a classic video game. Riddick is bland, but so is Gordon Freeman, or the Master Chief, or even the Doom guy if we're being totally honest. These characters lack personalities so that the player can insert themselves into the role without feeling at odds with the story or character. Riddick is, unlike those other characters, based on an actual previously established franchise, and so the already relatively uninteresting main character of the series actually works very well as a video game protagonist, because his character is just interesting enough to have a playful usage of dialogue, while also being just bland enough that his character doesn't intrude on the self-insert power fantasy experience that games like this typically aim for. It's also worth noting that Riddick as a character, as far as I can tell, having only seen 2 of the movies associated with him, is a character who is used as a vessel even within the context of the rest of the franchise. He's not completely devoid of personality, but he seems to be used more often as an entry point into the world surrounding him. He's very similar to Mad Max in that regard, a character caught in a bigger scenario in which his anti-hero status and his seemingly amorality that typically turns into an actual sense of morality by the end is used to explore a dark and interesting universe to which he belongs. Closest example to what we experience in the game that manifests in the Riddick movies, to me, would be Crematoria. The planet of Crematoria is one in which there is a very clear predicament and a very unclear solution to said predicament. Crematoria itself would make a fantastic setting for an entire video game, so it's already baked, no pun intended, into the series to have a lot of potential for exploration of settings. What I find so interesting about Riddick as a series is that it's sort of like Dark Star Wars, in that it's a series that carries itself over many different planets with many different environments and social climates. An entire prison planet versus one that appears to be highly religious. This Mad Max in space approach works really well for telling dystopian stories that can extend in scope far beyond the typical dystopian fiction that confines itself to a planet like our own. Can I just say, for the record, that I absolutely love the setting of Butcher Bay. Riddick definitely took a page from Half-Life's book when it came to setting because, like Black Mesa, Butcher Bay is a character in its own right. A setting that sort of breathes and has an ecosystem within its confines. Just the setup itself is great. A prison planet. Okay, no, not like that prison planet. This one is actually interesting. What I love about Butcher Bay as a setting is how well it lends itself to a game like this. A prison break game is not altogether unfathomable. In fact, make a few basic tweaks, and even the original Half-Life is basically a prison escape game. But the idea is that outside of the confines of a prison, there's ideally some external place to escape to. Having an entire planet be a prison means that escape simply isn't as easy as making it outside of the walls of the prison. So there's a sort of double task of getting out of the prison and getting off the planet. It's initially framed as an impossible escape, and given, well, the title of the damn game, it becomes immediately obvious that it will be very possible. The setting just allows the player to initially ask the question, but how? The answer requires going deeper and deeper into the belly of the bay as the security and detainment becomes more and more convoluted. The way that the game continually piles on top of itself with more elaborate ways of holding Riddick prisoner, I think is a testament to just how useful the setting of a prison planet can be. We start off in what appears to be a very basic prison situation, and where we end up, well, we'll get there when we get there. Butcher Bay is a great example of a setting design in games that I really don't know what to give a word or term to, despite being able to think of a few examples that embody the idea. Maybe viewers can think of a term to describe the idea, but I'll try to explain it as best as I can. The setting of Butcher Bay throughout the game requires weaving both in and out of an internal setting. The game has a self-contained setting of the prison, and then a setting external to the prison blocks that, for lack of a better term, show the guts of the facility. Much like how in Half-Life you frequently shift between science labs, which are the main intent of the facility, and behind-the-scenes areas like maintenance rooms, vents, elevator shafts, water pipes, and so on. What I mean to say by this is that the game very early on establishes an internal space and an external space, where the internal space is the prison block, where Riddick is supposed to be, and the external space is the prison's infrastructure. And throughout the game, Riddick will end up weaving in and out of the internal and external spaces, such that we begin in the prison space without a weapon and access to other areas, and then return to the prison space with a weapon and access to other areas, which means we'll technically not be backtracking, but sort of retracking, if that makes any sense. Technically, as far as I know, each wraparound to a previous area over time is accessing a new level in the game, and so the design that had to go into this requires taking what are, on a technical level, completely disjointed levels floating in an endless void of programming nothingness, and make them feel like a coherent place, and having the game sort of retrack Riddick's progress helps to make the setting feel like a coherent place instead of entirely separate entities, and also gives the player a light aha moment when they start to realize that they're back where they used to be. It's also worth noting that retracking is very important to selling a world in a game, because it serves the same basic function as an establishing shot in a movie. Having seen movies that are particularly low on establishing shots, I've noticed that without establishing shots, a film will feel disjointed, and it becomes hard to tell where settings are in relation to each other, or even where we are at any given moment. The Shining actually does a good job of intentionally using a lack of establishing shots in order to make the architecture of the Overlook Hotel feel disjointed and confused, and help create a subtly oppressive tone to that film. By retracking a couple times throughout the course of Escape from Butcher Bay, we get a stronger feel for how big the prison is, where things are in relation to each other, and are offered clever gameplay twists on areas we've previously explored. Without retracking, it would get disorienting after a while with no clear sense of direction. The interweaving design of the game mixed with the setting helps to really sell the prison breaking experience as more than just the crawl in hole, pick up gun, shoot guy, run away experience that it might otherwise end up being. I'm not typically one who is interested in suspending my disbelief, but the game does a good enough job on selling the idea of a prison planet in such a way that the setting really does feel like more than just a flimsy theater set, and actually does take on a character through an interesting balance of tone. The balance of tone in the game overall is being able to simultaneously create an oppressive atmosphere and construct Riddick as the ultimate badass, unafraid of the challenge ahead, completely unfazed by anything to cross his path. The way they manage this is by making the setting as hyper-masculine as the ideal that Riddick epitomizes. Every man, woman, child, dog, and stuffed animal in Butcher Bay wants to eat nails for breakfast, and they all speak in a gruff, menacing voice. I don't know if the game was trying to go for schlock, but schlock is what the game achieves. It actually works in the game's favor, because it already makes the characters surrounding Riddick unlikable. So when Riddick returns the favor with his gruff, sarcastic quips, it creates a sense of self-righteousness for the player where it becomes fun to actually play as Riddick, because he's the most likable in an entire sea of mumble-grumble tough dudes. The catharsis of watching a guy flex tough, only to be beaten senseless in 5 seconds flat through basic button mashing, is notable even if the game is inadvertently a vindication of toxic masculinity as a result. Personally, I take the story and setting of the game about as serious as I might for something like The Room or Battlefield Earth, and I don't think that's an entirely invalid perspective. I think that on some level the game is self-aware and in its self-seriousness, and wants the player to enjoy the power fantasy at the expense of the narrative, in a way that is only ever so vaguely similar to the plot of Doom 2016. The game, first and foremost, wants to be fun, and the overt seriousness of the characters I don't think should be conflated with the seriousness of the game itself. This isn't a case of ludonarrative dissonance, but something I like to call ludonarrative disconnect. Ludonarrative dissonance, for those who don't know, is the idea that the gameplay and narrative of a game can be telling dissonant stories or sharing dissonant morals, where the narrative might condemn violence while the gameplay encourages it. Ludonarrative disconnect, by contrast, is a term I like to use to describe instances in which the player becomes altogether distant from the narrative by nature of the game. Ludonarrative disconnect is not all that different from zoning out, but it can also be other things. For example, many games will be explicitly or implicitly condemning the player for violence against innocents within the game world, but they still allow the option. And while allowing the option doesn't necessarily cause dissonance between gameplay and narrative, it does allow disconnect, because it allows the player to completely disregard the narrative and how they approach the gameplay. By that token, my previous discussion of Half-Life can showcase a bit of ludonarrative disconnect, where the interactivity of the game obscures the narrative because it inadvertently, or possibly intentionally, encourages the player to not be looking for subtle cues that the narrative reveals through its environment. Playing Escape from Butcher Bay, I recognize a sort of playfulness to the gameplay that stands at a contrast to the seriousness of the setting and characters, but that doesn't seem to be altogether incidental to the tone of the game. For a linear, action stealth-driven experience, Escape from Butcher Bay offers a lot of moments of simply Riddicking around. I think that the self-serious characters and setting are meant to be a thin, morally simplistic framework that's easy to disregard, so that players will become more invested in the gameplay itself and immerse themselves in the experience rather than in the moral implications of the story. The game can be easily distinguished in its tone from something like Doom 3, for example. Doom 3 wasn't very playful in its tone, but was very, very serious. It attempted straight horror for the first time in the Doom series, and the Doom series had previously been known primarily for how not serious it would take itself. Doom 3's tone was consistently dark and oppressive in an almost disempowering way. Contrast that to Escape from Butcher Bay, a game that shows a sort of vaguely ironic detachment on behalf of the main character, who gives dry one-liners in response to the overly serious characters surrounding him. Yes, Riddick takes himself seriously, but to him, everything around him is a bit of a joke, but a joke that he gets to have fun with. The character loves violence. He loves the thrill of the hunt, whether he's the predator or the prey. The gameplay prioritizes exactly the thing that Riddick as a character prioritizes, and as a result, I think the game wants the player to also experience a bit of that same ironic detachment. Enjoy the power fantasy, because everything around you is a joke, even if these jokes don't think they're very funny. Before I get to the gameplay, I really need to give special commendation to Riddick as a character in this game, because the game wouldn't be even half as good without him. I'm not saying I find Riddick particularly deep or compelling, and honestly I don't even know if he's well written, but as a video game protagonist, he somehow manages to be the tiniest thread that holds the game together. Here's why. Escape from Butcher Bay, as far as I can tell, runs on the same engine as Doom 3. Being a huge fan of Doom 3 myself, as well as Quake 4 which runs on the same engine, as well as other shooters from this era like Halo 2 and Half-Life 2, I'm very aware of how tone manifests itself in this era of gaming, at least for this kind of game. Using Doom 3 as perhaps the best comparison point, Doom 3 is a game that's dark and horrific and tense. Doom 3 takes itself very seriously on the whole, even though the tone tries to mix itself with an early Evil Dead sense of tension and morbid humor. The Doom guy, for example, has no personality whatsoever in Doom 3. Given that the engine Riddick runs on was designed to emphasize lighting in particular, the ability to have stark contrast between darkness, dim lighting, and bright lighting, Riddick's graphics end up making the game feel sort of dark and bleak and oppressive to look at, much like Doom 3 and much like the setting of Butcher Bay itself. If that had been matched by the main character, I think the game would be really too dark to be much fun. It's the fact that Riddick fancies himself to be the one-liner action hero of his own game that really balances the tone out and keeps it a fun experience throughout. One-liners have basically never been funny or clever with action films, but if I were to outline a spectrum of effectiveness with one-liners, I would probably put the first Terminator film on the far end of doing it right. And if you go all the way to the other end of the scale and then jump off the cliff, the rocks you land on would contain The Running Man. The Running Man is probably the worst film ever for one-liners, but it becomes so unfunny and unclever that it wraps back around to being funny again, because you grow to appreciate the continuous pompous confidence that Arnie has in his god-awful jokes. Escape from Butcher Bay hits that same tone as The Running Man, where the embarrassing failure on behalf of the script, mixed with the confident, gravelly delivery from Vin Diesel, makes it so that at first I was annoyed by the one-liners, but as the game went on I began to anticipate them. What especially makes them work so well is that Riddick delivers them in such a dry monotone that it doesn't even come across as pompous, but an attempt at being badass that instead wraps back around and becomes just plain dorky.
Since rioting, my slam has become a damn war zone. I'm losing men faster than I can replace them, and all of this unrest, well, it began soon after you arrived, Riddick.
Could be a coincidence.
And that dorkiness is charming in and of itself. It's not often that we play games where the main character's lack of self-awareness makes the experience more enjoyable in a dorky way, especially not in a game of this variety. While the tone is relatively serious in terms of the setting and some of the characters and the story of the game, it's Riddick's ability to bring that tone down to something more playful that ends up making the game feel a lot more lighthearted than the immediate surroundings of the game might suggest. Alright, now it's time to finally get to the design of the game, which is what this video is supposed to be about. I first played this game I believe a little while before it came out. It was a demo attached to another Xbox game at the time. I think either Fusion Frenzy or one of the Halo games. Maybe something else. I remember being blown away by the demo and proceeded to buy the full game at some point and played it rigorously. At the time I thought it was one of the best shooters I had ever played, but that's where we can discuss design, because I had sort of mistakenly thought of it as a shooter. The construction of the modern game as we know it stems from one basic philosophy. How do we use all that we have available to us now to create a cohesive experience that masks the seams and restraints that give it shape? Or in more concrete terms, how do we mix design ideas both old and new together, and do so in such a way that people don't consciously notice that that's what we're doing? You see, cross-referencing genre tropes, conventions, mechanics, and so on has been going on for quite a while, but there's two ways of going about doing this. The more overt way is to brand the experience as an experimental game, something like Crypt of the Necrodancers or Frog Fractions, a game that clearly is meant to consciously recognize that it's combining different genres together. This could also be done in a less overt way, but still showing its ideas on its sleeve, something like Portal, which people can consciously recognize as a combination of first-person and puzzle gaming. The other way way of doing so is doing so subtly. It's combining genre tropes in such a way that blends them together, typically via a universal control scheme and consistent tone, blending them rather than mashing them together. The moment when a game like Star Wars Shadows of the Empire goes from being a platforming-based game to a vehicle-based game is very obvious. There are vehicle levels and there are platforming levels. By contrast, when Halo switches between being a first-person shooter and being a vehicle-based game, it's a bit less obvious. It's sad to say, but the defining difference between these two games is simply that Master Chief manually gets into a vehicle by pressing X. That simple act of giving the player the button needed and having the character walk up to a vehicle is what creates the illusion that we have not changed genres. Technically, we haven't, but vehicle combat is a different genre from first-person shooters, and Halo was one of the first shooter games that actually mixed vehicle combat into the game effectively. So what makes a modern game what it is how it can pull from a variety of influences and blend them together in a way that doesn't obviously call to mind what those influences are. Even though Escape from Butcher Bay is, in a lot of ways, very different from Half-Life, this is a very important aspect of why the game ends up getting compared to Half-Life, because Escape from Butcher Bay expands the language of the first-person shooter in order to create the experience that best suits what the game is going for. Riddick combines RPG, adventure, stealth, horror, beat 'em up, or fighting, mech, and wraps all of these things together through a first-person shooter control scheme. It does this mostly seamlessly, such that when I first played it, I never stopped to think that anything I was doing or experiencing was technically genre hopping. Instead, it just felt like a game. And that's what I mean when I discuss what a modern game is. That feeling that the sum of its parts is the foundation through which we can experience the whole. It's not a stealth game and then a shooter game, it's a stealth game and a shooter game at the same time. And while that might sound a little obvious and not all that impressive, it's when you consider just how well the game ties these genres together that makes the game stand out, especially for its time. While I would be likely to pin the game down as a first-person shooter first and foremost, I do think that's a little reductive. The first interaction you have with the game is speaking to an NPC, followed by stealth, and then eventually shooting. Clearly, the arcade sensibilities that the original Doom hoped to leave behind have mostly vanished by this point in gaming. The game's first footsteps are in setting up the experience of the setting and story and characters rather than the gameplay. The game wants the setting to be as important to the experience as the action. And while the first level does give a little shorthand of what the rest of the game will be like, the early levels of the game on the whole suggest that the developers want players to become involved in the world before they go looking for action. When you first arrive in prison, the game first showcases the RPG and adventure elements. Again, much like Half-Life, the game forces you into a situation where you interact with those around you, except this time it's with inmates rather than nerdy scientists. This, again, reminds me of the early moments of an RPG, where you're encouraged to spend a little bit of time in a local town speaking to various NPCs and hearing their canned responses. The game also has other light RPG elements, and I do mean light, though also noteworthy. There are side missions, there's inventory, there's options for different responses to what people say, and a few other small things like that. Side missions in particular help to build the world out a bit more, but they're easily one of the weakest aspects of the game in terms of the experience. Despite some non-linearity, Escape from Butcher Bay is a fairly linear experience, and oftentimes you either won't find the things that you need in order to complete a side mission, or you won't be able to make it back to the person in order to collect your prize. It ends up being absolutely a completionist time waster, so if that's your thing, have at it. But while I do think that it helps sell the world of the game, it also is undermined by just how much the game's linearity encourages you to ignore the side quests altogether. The game definitely has some light adventure game elements too, and weirdly enough, the game that came to mind when I played Butcher Bay was Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Given Amnesia isn't an adventure game, but when you take away the horror aspects of the game and focus on the gameplay aspects, it is very much a first-person adventure game, with all of the same makings of a point-and-click. Picking up a multitude of items and needing to use them in certain spots and in certain ways in order to progress to new locations is a staple of the point-and-click adventure game, and that was very prevalent in Amnesia as well as in Escape from Butcher Bay, albeit a bit less so. It might seem very, very basic that you would need to pick up a bomb from one specific area and then plant it in another specific area in order to progress, but that is an adventure game mechanic, one that notably wasn't present even in the original Half-Life. Escape from Butcher Bay helps show the progression of the modern game in this regard, that this basic adventure game element had been relatively non-existent in other games of this variety. Now let's talk about the fighting game elements of Butcher Bay. This aspect is one of the main reasons I became inspired to make this video, because I had noticed something about Riddick that was different from many other games in the FPS genre. Comparing Riddick to Doom 3, pay attention to how melee is handled. When you take out your fists in Doom 3, it's nothing more than pressing fire and watching a basic animation. You have no control over how your character punches. By contrast, in Riddick, you can hold up your arms to block, you can punch in 4 different directions, left, right, up, and down. What I find interesting is that this is a fighting game and beat-em-up mechanic that has been lifted from that genre and put into a first-person perspective, making Riddick, in part, a fighting game or a beat-em-up. While you don't have special moves and technically only have rudimentary combo options, there actually is a lot of usefulness to the melee in Escape from Butcher Bay, and you have to actually end up employing some combination of all of the different kinds of melee attacks in order to successfully take out a lot of enemies in the game. The fact that the game can take a basic fighting game mechanic, one that's not very common in shooters, and then utilize it in a way that makes it fluent with the rest of the game as well as actually necessary to utilize to its full potential, especially on higher difficulties, is something to commend the game for, because even to this day, most shooters wouldn't bother with these kinds of mechanics, even despite the fact that here, they're rather well implemented. Well, for the most part. The mech sections of the game are probably the weakest in terms of actual gameplay, but the spectacle and the catharsis that comes with it really helps make these moments stand out and feel like some of the more interesting moments of the game. Granted, you see guards in mech suits relatively early on, with the very first one being a sort of boss battle, and later they become an undefeatable enemy for the middle portions of the game. When you eventually do get to wear a mech suit and reverse the power dynamic on the guards, that reversal plays into the psychology of the person playing the game in a way that's a hell of a lot of fun. It's one of those many moments in the game that embodies the phrase, "The hunter has now become the hunted." The horror elements of the game were initially some of my favorite moments of the game on my first playthrough, though in retrospect I do think both are actually a bit weak, though definitely one is much weaker than the other. The pit, an early level in the game, is the first instance of an overtly horror tone in a sequence, and while the mutants you end up fighting are really fucking cheesy seeing them as an adult, the scene is still relatively effective because of the slowly failing flashlight on the shotgun, as well as the potential for enemies to come from any direction and catch you by surprise in a claustrophobic environment. What makes this scene so weak, however, is that it's just too short. It's over in no time, and a horror segment of a game like this really needs to linger in order to be effective, because it changes the flow and pacing of gameplay. It puts the player in a particularly disempowered position, and these things simply don't work if they only remain true for an insignificant amount of time. Horror relies on tension, and tension can't last for only a short burst, which makes the pit feel more like a hiccup than the pivot it intends to be. It's especially weakened by how much the early chapters of the game emphasize the pit as having an ominous quality. That should be the moment where things start to look different. That's supposed to be the game's equivalent of Half-Life's Resonance Cascade, but instead it feels like a shooting gallery minigame. The second horror moment in the game, the one with the strange alien creatures, I think is much more effective because it goes on for a longer time. It has better level design to accompany the possibility that a monster could come from any angle, and it intentionally has interplay between the aliens and the prison guards, such that you can walk in on a fight between them and either try to move past without being noticed, or opt to try to kill whatever group you think would be harder to deal with on their own. Typically, when I walked into a scene like this, I would kill the guards so that they couldn't fire at me while they were busy with the aliens, so that I could deal with the aliens separately and not have to worry about long-range attacks. And having that approach to gameplay be an option during this section of the game already puts it leagues above the pit in terms of effectiveness. Another reason why the horror moments aren't very effective in Escape from Butcher Bay is precisely because another aspect of the game is very effective: the stealth. The stealth in the game is obviously the top priority of the genre blending going on here, as the game prioritizes stealth mechanics throughout most of the game, and the stealth sections easily offer the most rewarding moment-to-moment gameplay. Because the stealth is so well done, because the tone of the game showcases a fearlessness to both the character and his inhabiting of the surroundings, the horror aspects of the game feel even more half-assed. After all, what's scary about the dark when the dark is Riddick's favorite? So let's talk about the stealth itself. The stealth in Riddick is easily the game's best asset, and this isn't just because it's well implemented. After all, there's plenty of stealth games both before and after Butcher Bay that have well implemented stealth gameplay. What makes the stealth in Riddick so rewarding is how it perfectly blends with, of all things, the lighting. Hear me out. The Doom 3 engine was made to emphasize the lighting first and foremost. It wants to showcase how dynamic lighting can really help fill out a world and set a tone, even if that world is dimly lit and cold like what we see in Doom 3. Riddick follows this trend, but takes it to the logical conclusion. If lighting can be so dynamic and contrast the dark and light so well, then what if we make that a core mechanic of the gameplay? As such, Riddick's basic stealth mechanic is that he can hide in the dark, and while in the dark, he can be relatively undetected by guards. This is vital to the experience of the game because it transforms the game from a running gun to a cat and mouse. The thrill of the hunt is top priority here, and that manifests in most of the way the game is constructed, but especially in the lighting. The game wants you to hide in the dark. It wants the dark to be your ally, to be your comfort zone. By doing this so effectively, the game calls attention to the lighting and the setting and the visuals of the game really well without ever needing to make you self-aware that this is what you're focusing on. The player becomes immersed in the game, and through the immersion of the mechanics, the world is allowed to feel more genuinely lived in. I thought of one moment in particular that really sold the craft of the game for me, and here it is. Now this may seem like a mundane moment, but this moment I think really showcases the major point I'm trying to make about how modern games are constructed. Let's look back at the original Doom for comparison. Doom had some of the absolute best lighting for its time, and they managed to do this in a very simple manner. The shadows were mapped out quite literally onto the map as having separate lighting so that when you stepped from one part of the floor to another, you would immediately transfer into the shadows. This means that the lighting could never change really, and monsters and objects could never cast a shadow. It was simple and effective for the time, but compared to the tech we have now, it's much less impressive. What I find so important about this mundane clip of Riddick riding an elevator is that, because the dark is a safe zone, the dynamic lighting of the scene, changing as the elevator rises, means that Riddick has to find a new place to hide in order to keep up with the changing shadows around him. While from a player perspective that seems fairly obvious, think about it from a designer's perspective. How much effort has to go into the lighting, into the engine, into the mechanics of stealth, in order to make it so that when Riddick is in shadows, the guards have a harder time detecting him than when he's in the light. All of these different factors of just the basics of lighting, a level, have an attention to detail that is unmatched by even other games of the time. It's the fact that this mundane moment isn't noteworthy that actually makes it noteworthy. In order to create an immersive experience, you have to not be consciously thinking about what the designers are doing in order to give you the experience you're having. So when I naturally reacted to the changing shadows by trying to find a more secure place to hide on the elevator, I was subconsciously revealing that the game is well made enough that players aren't thinking immediately about the developer's role in constructing the experience, but only our own role in experiencing it. All in all, the stealth mechanic's a really great start to finish. I especially like the ability to drag bodies into the shadows in order to avoid the suspicion of other guards. But in a lot of respects, the game works like a typical stealth game. There are alert phases which usually start playing music or alarms, and you have to either get to a safe hiding place, kill whoever has you spotted, or turn off an alarm in order to get the phase to end. During these phases, killing everyone is an option, but it's rarely the easiest or best option. And in some alert phases, killing everyone is not an option. And so while stealth isn't technically necessary to beat these parts, it is heavily encouraged. One of my favorite qualities of any game is when a game can have a variety of styles that are optional and none are altogether invalidated. If, for example, getting caught in Riddick would cause the game to reset itself immediately, a la getting busted in Grand Theft Auto, then it wouldn't be nearly as engaging of an experience as it is. Although plenty of other stealth games allow you to keep playing after getting spotted, it's worth noting that having the option of running away or fighting your way through an encounter is a valuable thing regardless, because you could technically choose to play the game with as little stealth as possible, and while you might not do a very good job, the game will still largely allow it, and that means that I can have a variety of approaches to any given playthrough or any given section, and I'm not forced to play by dev rules. I'm not altogether against hand-holding on the part of the developers, but when a game is holding your hand, it's best if the player isn't noticing it as they're playing. So while the devs did account for players potentially brute forcing their way through the game and heavily discourage it, having it technically be possible is an important feature that helps fill out the experience so that it doesn't feel like it's on rails from start to finish. The way that the AI works is admittedly fairly rudimentary, but in a way that I feel serves the gameplay rather well. In the constructed power fantasy of the game, you're playing as the ultra badass Riddick, and so giving the AI just enough basic intelligence to appear like mindless guards helps to convey the idea that Riddick really does have an upper hand. They never quite feel like mindless AI robots that are pre-programmed to do certain things, though I do think the seams start to show here, especially during stealth sections. In particular, what makes the AI of the game work is the voice acting and dialogue, because the guards come across as just the worst assholes, which entirely vindicates the player taking joy in cleverly taking them out one by one. Mixing the pompous attitude of the guards with the somewhat, though not entirely mindless AI, makes the cat and mouse game all the better. The game is also punishingly difficult to make up for the ego that the game encourages in the player. The health system makes it rather hard to maintain high amounts of health for very long, and a gunner can take you from full health to nothing in a very short amount of time. As a result, when in a firefight and empty-handed, every action counts, and depending on how much health you have going into a situation, you might often find yourself having to trial and error your way through a few sections. The gunplay is so easy to die from that during a later section where guns become emphasized, I could swear the developers started adding in several more opportunities to pick up health in order to offset the difficulty. And if that's the case, then props to them for being able to cover up a potential flaw by just being a bit more lenient to changes in gameplay style. Lastly, I want to talk about the shooter part of this first-person shooter. Surprisingly, very little of the game is actually shooting, and when you do finally get a hold of guns, it ends up being more of a set piece than a consistent mechanic of the game. As opposed to a game like Half-Life where each gun you pick up you end up taking with you for the rest of the game, in Riddick, you get very few weapons at all and you are often deprived of them at key points in the story. As a result, the game seems to really want you to focus on the stealth, but the sections where you do shoot your way through encounters definitely provides a much needed change of pace. The section where you first get the assault rifle, for example, is another example of the game doing the hunter becomes the hunted idea, which is a trend throughout the game. It's the die-hard ho 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 I have a machine gun moment, where Riddick is now in control of enough power to take out way more guards than he was initially. Having this section so early does a great job of escalating the game and allowing the early parts of the game to not end up feeling dull too soon, but it also has a knock-on effect that unfortunately brings it down a little. After this section, you basically don't get to use the assault rifle again for the rest of the game, and the second major shooting section forces you to use the shotgun throughout most of it. The game doesn't have a lot of weapons, but it's not exactly barren either, and never getting to use the full weapon set at any given time is definitely a drawback to the experience, because it makes it feel a little bit more disjointed than it might otherwise. The assault rifle section goes from being a tense section to being specifically the assault rifle section, and when it's over so quickly it feels a bit like a lost opportunity. Despite this, the shooting in the game is mostly a lot of fun, and my particular favorite weapon is the taser pistol, because it's the gun that most emphasizes a stealth approach, which again has the knock-on effect of feeling a bit like a wasted opportunity. I'd love to be able to go through the whole game with this thing, and they could have expanded the experience to allow for more playful scenarios with the taser pistol, where it becomes a mechanic that's much more tied into the stealth rather than largely incidental to the stealth. That said, I really enjoy using the taser pistol, and it's endlessly fun going up to tased guards and stomping them to death, a true delight. While it's hard not to examine the game as the sum of its parts, it's how these things collectively form a whole that obscures its parts by being so immersive, that really makes it a worthwhile game to pick up. It's a genuinely great stealth action prison escape game, and it pulls from all of these other genres and their mechanics in order to fill out that experience. And while it's very obvious if we're going over the game with a fine-tooth comb, while actually playing the game, it never becomes immediately apparent that we switched from a stealth game to a beat-em-up, or from a beat-em-up to an RPG, or from an RPG to a horror, and so on. By utilizing all of these ideas not just for their own sake, but to suit the tone, setting, story, and experience of the game, Riddick helps continue the trend set by a game like Half-Life in blending genres into cohesive experiences. And so it's another great example of a step forward in the modernization of games. It's also noteworthy because this game is not just serving its own purpose, it's also serving as a tie-in to a larger franchise. And part of the reason why it works so well is because it mixes the language of its own series with the language of gaming perfectly. The Chronicles of Riddick had many elements that could be gamified, but the game chose to emphasize the gritty Mad Max tone, the charisma and Mary Sue-ness of its main character, and fill it out with just the smallest amount of lore, and threw away the rest. Instead, Escape from Butcher Bay creates a self-contained experience within the universe of the Riddick series, but without relying on the universe, instead relying on its own ideas that help contribute to that universe in fun and playful ways. By choosing to remain largely self-contained, the game allows itself to focus on honing in the gameplay and fine-tuning it to near perfection, rather than turning it into a bloated mess, which I might be willing to assume would be the case if they had directly adapted the film The Chronicles of Riddick in a video game form. The typical movie tie-in likes to gamify the plot of a movie, and this can sometimes work like in Toy Story 2 on the Nintendo 64, or it can backfire horribly like The Ring Terror's Realm. Other times, it can work and fail at the same time, such as Minority Report Everybody Runs, in which the game is relatively faithful to the basic plot of Minority Report, but by gamifying the premise, the game completely undermines the premise by forcing the player to mercilessly murder hundreds of people during a game where you're supposed to be trying to prove that you won't end up being a murderer. Escape from Butcher Bay doesn't need to contradict the story it's based on because they constructed their own story from the ground up, and that story can fit into the context of the wider universe, but can also be designed with gameplay and video game pacing in mind. Take note, game designers, this is how you make a movie game. That covers most of what I wanted to talk about, but I want to talk about the sections of the game start to finish and just give my quick thoughts on them. The opening section, the dream that Riddick has where he dreams of escape, I think does a great job of setting up the tone, hinting at what the gameplay will be like, and informing the character. While I respect this section for what it's attempting to do, I would have been perfectly fine without it, and I think it's a relatively mundane section of the game on subsequent playthroughs. The game proceeds into 3 layers of prison security, and at first, Riddick is put in the most minimum security section of the prison. This is definitely one of the weaker parts of the game, but it's also the setup before things start to pick up. Really nothing to write about in much detail, but a necessary if a bit boring section. One thing that particularly bothers me about this early section of the game is how much the game hammers in the control scheme in a non-diegetic manner. We see in the HUD tips that we are forced to click so that we know how to use controls that I've already been using for years. In my opinion, if you're going to have tutorials, you should either make them tangential to the game like the Hazard course in Half-Life 1, or you should weave them into the diegesis of the game such that it doesn't feel like a tutorial. The worst option is mandatory tutorials or pop-ups. When you first begin to break out, the gameplay immediately starts to pick up and becomes more interesting, but thanks to the cramped spaces and not particularly inspired scenarios, it's not until Riddick gets the assault rifle that the game starts to become a lot of fun, for me at least. From there, however, the segment with the assault rifle is one of the best sections of the game because, as I stated before, it's when Riddick first goes from being powerless to powerful, and that shift in power dynamic is cathartic as hell and really starts to give you the feeling that you're going to make it out of this prison in no time. After the first fight with Abbott, we of course learn that this isn't the case. The second layer of prison security, Tower 17, is probably my third favorite section of the game. Seeing the creativity of this sci-fi prison is a lot of fun, and this is where the game most emphasizes its RPG and beat-em-up elements. Quite literally so, in fact. You have to arrange multiple fights and literally beat 'em up until you earn a reputation. I love this section even though it's very repetitive, mostly because it's a welcome change of pace in a very different section from the rest of the game. Then there's the second fight with Abbott, which, well, yeah. The game starts to pick up after you use Abbott's card to get into the mines. The mines are a bit hard to figure out my way around, and due to my inability to do well with non-linearity, I did end up walking around in circles a couple times before figuring out what to do. Regardless, this section is one of the most fun sections of the game, and probably the part that most emphasizes stealth, particularly because the guards in mech suits are basically invincible during this section. Following that, there's the section where you pilot a mech suit, and that bit, while mundane gameplay-wise, is just so enjoyable and again is a welcome change of pace. Towards the end of the Tower 17 section of the game, you get the taser pistol, and this is probably my second favorite part of the game overall, mostly because I just fucking love the taser pistol. Not much to say about the section otherwise, but it's just extremely my shit. Then there's the section with the Xenos, which I think is a decent section of the game, and on a first playthrough it's probably one of the most memorable and exciting moments, but on repeat playthroughs it's really not much more than decent compared to the rest of the experience. I think I tend to prefer the stealth sections a bit more, so the lack of stealth in this section is a nice change of gameplay style, and thankfully it goes on for long enough to not feel like a missed opportunity. And while I enjoy this section, it's not the part I'm most eager to revisit. After a second escape attempt, you reach maximum security. This is by far my favorite part of the game, and it had me blindsided on first playthrough. After the gritty, grimy, lively hostility of Butcher Bay's darkest depths, seeing the pristine, sanitized, brightly lit white exercise room was a moment in gaming I don't think I'll ever forget. It felt so left field on my first playthrough that every time I replay it, I'm eager to get to this part in particular, if for no other reason than what a major shift in aesthetic it ends up being. I particularly like the sense of humor to the room. The walls say ocean, flow, tree, and sunset, trying to evoke mental images of nature and positivity in the most bleak and least natural environment possible. That shameless and weak attempt to evoke something less depressing is hilarious. I tend not to think much about plot when engaging with most art, but one kind of plot line that I very much enjoy is the kind where someone has to use their wit in order to escape a seemingly impossible situation where the odds are stacked 1,000,000 to 1. The more absurdly difficult it might seem to break free, the more invested I become. This is how Butcher Bay on the whole feels, and that the increasing amount of security piling on top of Riddick makes it all the more cathartic when he escapes. Playing this section of the game for the first time, however, I legitimately played for quite a while not knowing how to escape, and I thought for a second that it might actually be the end of the game. Obviously I know now that that's not true, but at the time I was floored. Here Riddick is in cryo storage, only awake long enough to run around in a circle before being gassed back to sleep, with no possible means of escape, no secret holes or trapdoors, nobody to even talk to except a complete loon. When I eventually did discover the very easy solution to this section, I felt really accomplished. In retrospect, it probably seems a bit obvious, but either experience still helps this section feel really great to play. The final section with the mech is, to me, the true finale of the game, and while I don't think it's a particularly amazing segment of the game, the one thing that makes it really worthwhile is the mech talking to the player and telling them to save ammo by stepping on enemies. This is a great example of a joke in a game because not only does it tie into the gameplay and the mechanics, but it also spins a humorous twist on the gameplay. The fact that the mech is instructing you how to better murder prison guards showcases how little Butcher Bay cares for human life, and how oblivious technology is to the value of human life, thinking on purely factual, amoral terms. A cute little piece of dark comedy. The very final bit is a short boss battle with two inexplicable guard robots that protect the prison warden. It was really impressive on a first playthrough, but playing through it again recently, it's not very well programmed, it's way too easy, and it's also too much of a non sequitur to work as a finale. It's a bit of a shame that the last section of gameplay is a bit of a misstep, because otherwise I think the final sections of the game are actually some of the best the game has to offer. So then, instead of killing the prison warden in gameplay, which would have honestly been more fun, you instead watch a final cinematic in which Riddick tricks the guards into killing the prison warden, and you escape, presumably to embarrass yourself in the movie that this game is a prequel to. Look at him go. So that's the Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. All in all, there's only so many ways that I can say this game is a lot of fun. The game is a right mix of pulp and wit, a willingness to be a bit embarrassing, but as a result, it makes the actual act of playing the game more inviting. It's surprising, replaying this game in 2018, just how much of a voice Escape from Butcher Bay still has in relation to the modern gaming landscape. There still really aren't a lot of games like this one, and while this game wasn't influential the same way Half-Life 1 was, the game certainly carries on the spirit that made that game so influential in the first place. I don't know if this game is overlooked or not, but if you have overlooked it, I recommend giving it a go. It's not perfect, in fact it's kind of deeply flawed, but those flaws are usually off to the side and don't impact the core of the game. That core is a willingness to use whatever it has in order to make the experience feel more comprehensive. This game perfectly gamifies the feeling of being Riddick, and puts him in the absolute best possible setting to really work through the strengths of Riddick as a character. It manages to be a linear game that is sometimes just a combination of set pieces, without ever feeling quite like that's what it is. While there are some weaker moments, there were no moments where I was absolutely bored, even when I've beaten it several times, and I'm sure in the future I'll play it more. Maybe not the game I'd immediately put in after already beating it, but an occasional gem to come back to. This video is the second in a series of videos that I've started where I look at a single video game and how it was constructed in depth. The current name for this series is An Analysis of Design, and if you like this video then I definitely recommend checking out the first video in the series, the first video being about the original Half-Life. I intend to make more of these in the future. Typically they'll be about games that I'm already well familiar with, so I do have limitations of what games I cover, but if you'd like to offer any suggestions, feel free to post them in the comments or mention me in a tweet and I'll hopefully respond. I currently have a Patreon and I'm trying to raise funds for college tuition as well as channel expenses, so if you'd like to support me or my work, you can feel free to pledge there. All generosity is appreciated but not required, and I'll always be trying to make the best content I can. As always, thanks so much for watching, it means a lot.